Hi, and welcome to the Acrylic Portrait Painting Challenge Masterclass, lesson number 6, creating smooth shading and skin tones. I'm so excited you're here. It's always been a pleasure here to teach you, and I'm looking forward to showing you how to take your portrait to the next level in this challenge. How's your painting coming along? Are you doing well with it? I've seen a lot of great portraits being posted in the Facebook group currently as I record this lesson, and it's so exciting to see you in your process. People are really getting the glazing technique, they're loving it. They're painting portraits like they never thought they could before. I see some excellent shading, excellent color being established, and it's just exciting to see other artists during the middle of a pandemic as I record this video, doing something amazing with their time, creating something beautiful for other people to enjoy in this world. If you happen to be experiencing any struggles in this time, and that does happen as you learn anything, it can be challenging, let me know. I'll be happy to guide you in any way I can. I do want to encourage you as well. If you haven't registered for this challenge, by all means, register. It's not too late. When you register for the challenge, I'll send you a welcome kit, and in the welcome kit you'll get the complete supplies list, so you know all the paints that you're going to need to paint along with us. You're also going to get the photo, the reference photo with the grid, and the palette layout guide, so you know how to lay out your palette, get all the colors chromatically arranged so nothing gets muddy, it's easier to mix, and there's a lot less frustration in the process while painting. So register today. I'd like to send you all that stuff that'll help you to paint this portrait with us. You can do that below at realisticacrylic.com/acrylic-portrait-painting-challenge. The link is right here on the bottom of the screen, also in the description of the video, and I'll also put it in the comments as well. So you'll be able to find that link right away, register. It's free, and you can still do it. It's not too late. So love to have you as a part of the challenge here. So, all right, well, before I get started, I want to ask a blessing. I know that I need God's help to continue painting this portrait well and to teach you everything you need so you can do it too. So I'm going to just invite God to help in this process. Father, I ask a blessing here on this painting. Help me again, Lord. You've guided me this far. Now help me to finish this painting well, to capture the likeness of the subject, the special something that really makes him unique, to capture the shading, the detail, the form, all those different things, and to be able to teach it well so the students would understand exactly how to paint this, and that, Lord, you would guide their brush strokes, ease any frustration that they might have in painting, Lord, that they would just be a perfect piece as they paint, and they would be amazed at what they've been able to create with their own hands, Lord, as you bless them and guide every brush stroke. Father, protect them, keep them safe in the middle of this pandemic in the name of Jesus. And if people are watching this afterwards, Lord, I pray you would keep them safe in that time too. Protect them from sickness, protect them from any harm. Guide them close to you, Lord, in Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, we're ready to begin. So our first step is to dive in with glazes on the shadow side of the face. That's step number 1. So I want to show you where I left off though. On the last lesson, lesson number 5, I did need to do a little more work on this just to get this to the level for this particular lesson. So I did a few bonus videos, and if you're an all-access member of Realistic Acrylic Portrait School, you'll have access to these bonus videos as well. But in the bonus videos, I put a few more layers on his hat using raw umber dark and ultramarine blue, and then brought some of that shading down into his face, painted on top of his eyes, and the background, did a few glazes there as well on his neck, and then I added a couple of glazes on his face, just establishing some of the beginning foundational work for the skin tones. All right, so I added some kind of pinkish tones on his ear, around his eyes and cheek, and a little bit on his neck. And for that I used alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, organic red orange, and raw sienna. So a few different colors for that. There's a contrast. There's a contrast between the kind of yellowish tones that we have over the predominant part of the shadow of his face, and then the pinkish tones. And you really want to study that reference photo. Really pay close attention to the reference photo and look for the areas that seem pinker. Make that judgment and say, where are those areas? And then strategically, you want to start adding glazes to lock in that particular color for that particular area. Now, I mentioned this in my bonus videos. I'm going to mention it to you in the main masterclass. That would be this idea of shapes. You know, every value has its own shape. So as you look at the reference photo, you're going to see that the pink area, and we're talking about colors and values at the same time, but there's going to be both areas of color and value, and they're going to occupy a certain shape within this large context. So it's almost like the shapes you'd have in a country. You know, you'd have a nation, like the nation of the United States of America. And within the United States of America, I'm just using that as an example because that's where I live, you have several states. And I live in the state of Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, it's shaped kind of like a hand or like a glove. And then you have other states with different shapes. But we have that whole large area comprised of all these little different smaller shapes. And they make up the large state or large nation of the United States of America. And in the same way, we have this whole large section, this large shape here. Okay, this shadow has a certain distinct shape. It has boundary lines, and they follow the edges that we sketched in. All right, and it kind of follows this whole area right here. And a little harder to see the boundary edges, but there is a boundary edge on the bottom as well. But then within this particular shape, we have some smaller shapes. And those would be like the states, all right? Just go with me on this metaphor here. And so we have these smaller shapes like kind of, you know, the pinkish tones we have up on his cheek. And if you look at the reference photo, you can see that. It occupies a certain shape. I'm going to grab my brush so you can really see the edge here. It follows right along here. You see that on the reference photo? And then it goes up, but it has a distinct end. I really want you to study your reference photo and see where that shape ends. Because when you can see it, when you can see that difference, then you can then go to the next step, and that's painting. This step here is called observation, but then we also want to interpret what we see and paint that onto the canvas. Then when you see this shape, you'll know, oh yeah, this has to go about this far on my canvas, on the actual painting. All right, I'm going to dive in here now with, let's see, I'm going to do a large glaze. Okay, so this would be like covering the whole nation, so to speak, if we want to use that metaphor. I'm gonna do a large glaze covering this whole shadowed section here. All right, and I just want to warm it up overall. And I'm going to take a little bit of raw sienna. And I think that's it. I think I'm just going to take a little bit of raw sienna so you can see the mixture. Again, wiping off that raw sienna off the side, dipping the matte medium into it, mixing the two together, keeping the pure pigment on one side, pure matte medium on the other. And notice I'm only mixing into a corner of it, so I'm not affecting that matte medium. I want this to stay clear so I can mix into that later. But I'm just pulling in by swirling the brush what I need and then tapping it into the bristles and flipping the brush over to get a smooth, uniform mixture. I have it loaded up on my brush. Now I'm going to start here on the left hand side. I'm going to work my way across. Let's add a little more raw sienna, make this mixture somewhat more opaque. Oh, maybe about 90% medium, 10% paint, 90% medium, 10% paint. Just going to go over everything here. Yeah, I'll even go over his hair. Why not? It has a slightly yellowish cast. And what I'm doing is just kind of warming this whole section up and just unifying it a little bit. Now here, yeah, that should get somewhat bluish, but I'm going to add that glaze later. I just want to warm this shadow up a little more. I want to make sure I have this going all the way across to the edge. All right, and I don't think I'm going to add any right here. I'm going to leave that be. But I want to see if I can use this glaze on the background at all, because we do have some of these somewhat yellowish tones. So I tell you what, I'm just going to add it to the background really quick up to certain points. And that just kind of warms the whole thing up. And it tends to promote color unity within your picture, really gives it a nice luminosity and depth to do this. But I don't want to add this yellowish color if I discern that here, according to the reference photo, if the color doesn't have enough yellow in it, I'm not going to add it here. All right, this looks kind of grayish, a little more cool in tone. This is warmer in tone. I'm going to add just a little bit to the top here, where we have that little band of color representing probably the edge of a roof or something like that. Step back and look at it for a bit. Yeah, so I like that. That just warms everything up a little bit. And I'll let that dry. And now for the next part of this first step, I want to start adding some glazes on the highlight portion of his face. And it does need to get some more glazes on it. It does need to get some shading on it. Otherwise, it's going to end up being very flat. But first, before I added those glazes onto the highlight portion of the face, I really wanted to establish the darker tonal values and shapes of the main shadow section of the face. Because if I started trying to get the skin tones in, and that's what I see with a lot of beginning artists, they're very concerned about skin tones. And I know I've mentioned this before, but it's just good to remind you guys of this. A lot of artists really want to lock in the skin tones, but they neglect the values, and that's a big mistake. Again, values are more important than skin tones. Just like building a house, we got to do it step by step in the right sequence. And skin tones come later. So after we establish the major shapes of the tonal values, and we get the shaded portion of the face as dark as it should be, or at least, well, not as dark as it should be, but it's substantially dark. We have at least a handful of glazes on here at this point. Now we can go in and start to get some of the values and the glazes and the nuances and the blending and the shading on the highlight portion of his face. Now, by contrast, we're going to be able to see the difference between the two. If we started putting the shadows and everything on this portion of the face, the highlight portion of the face, prematurely, before we had the shadows established here, we wouldn't be able to see what we're doing, because value is all relative. And without having the context of enough shadow work on this side of the face, you just wouldn't be able to tell what's going on, and this would end up looking too dark. You might either go too light or too dark with your nuances. But now we have a benchmark. Now we have kind of a value key to then interpret how much to add on this part of the face. Okay, I just want to make that clear. I know it's a lot of explanation, but it's very important. And I want to make sure you know everything you need to know to do this painting and other paintings in the future successfully. All right. Now, I'm going to mix with raw sienna, but I do want to add a little bit of organic red orange. Organic red orange. I want to get something that's somewhat pink in tone. So raw sienna, organic red orange. I think I'm gonna go with more organic red orange because I see a lot of pinks in the face and I want to start to pull them out. But just those two colors. Just those two colors. And let's see. We're making it pretty light. You can see the mixture and it is fairly light. But it is a little darker than the initial mixtures. It's probably like 90% medium, 10% paint. Okay. You just want to barely affect it. I'm testing it out. Just want to barely see a difference. You probably can just barely see what's going on, but let's add a little glaze to the top of his nose because I look at the reference photo and I say, oh yeah, that value is darker up there. That value is darker, so let's really establish that in there. And we're going to get it a little bit darker. And I'm going to add a little bit of a glaze on the bottom of his nose, but not all the way to the bottom, just hitting the corner. And I'm leaving this area here basically alone because that's got kind of a bluish cast to it. It's reflecting the light from his shirt, so I don't want to put this pinkish glaze on the bottom of that. I want to hit that with a different color. But again, just adding this color on the top of the nose and then a little on his cheeks, and we're going to add the glaze right here using brush strokes in different directions, and I'm not putting it in the middle because the middle should be a little bit lighter. So you probably just barely see the difference, but we have to start somewhere, and since this is very, very light in value, we can't go too dark. Just go super, super light, because what you don't want to do is add a glaze that's as dark as this area here. The glaze needs to be a lot lighter. Look at what I'm doing and see how it's just barely making a difference. I can just barely tell what I did. And if you can just barely tell what you did, perfect. But I'm going to add a pinkish color to the top of his lip, and I'm just gliding the corner of the brush along, barely affecting the color. You don't want to darken his lips too much. They're very light in value. The sun is striking them just at the top. So this top portion is very, very light. And that's why I'm using a very faint glaze. I'm going to leave off there on that, but I do want to change that crease and bring that up a little higher. That's going to bother me otherwise. So let's do that, taking some titanium white and a little bit of Indian yellow just to warm it up, because titanium white by itself will be a bit too chalky. Maybe a bit of raw sienna because it's a little too light in value. So if you have any mistakes with your sketch where you need to correct things, it can be done. You want to get the sketch as accurate as you can, but inevitably you'll see things in the painting process that you missed during the sketch and you have to correct it. That's not a big deal. I'm just adding this titanium white, raw sienna, Indian yellow mixture to the top of this line and just shifting it a little bit by painting on top of that line. And yeah, I think that's going to be better. Somehow I made this line like right in the middle between these 2 points, but it actually, this is more like 2/5 and this is 3/5, or this is 1/3 and that's 2/3. And like I told you, how we always try to make everything so even and symmetrical and patterned, we have to fight that tendency. Well, I got caught up in that tendency myself, and I made that line right in the middle when I should have had that at 1/3 and then 2/3. But you know, we all make mistakes, and that's okay. During the painting process, you'll catch things from your sketch. You'll be able to fix up, and it's never too late to do that. So you do the sketch as best you can, but if you have to make changes, no big deal. For the last part of step number 1, I want to add some glazes onto the shadowed side of his face. I want to add some glazes kind of hitting these reddish areas a little bit more. So let's do that. And I'm going to take my 1/2 inch flat. Let's use organic red orange as the base. Maybe a little bit of alizarin crimson. And then a bit of raw sienna. And we kind of can make a nice warm reddish color. I'm going to put it up here. And I'm looking at the reference photo. I see some of it right here underneath his hat. And then I also see it on top of his nose. And I want to get a little bit more to the pinkish side, so I'm going to grab from this pinkish side of the mixture. And I'm going to add some on top of his cheek. And let's see, also on this area by his neck. So I'm just going over that. And there's a little bit under his chin. Just a tiny bit at the jugal fold, right here on the jowls. And then, let's see, maybe I'll take my small round edge brush, this, what is this, size 4. And I'm going to add just a couple of these glazes within the eyes in a few key spots. So this would be like the counties. You know, we painted it like the states here, or provinces. Now these small little areas are like counties. We just want to get these in just the right spots. So I'm adding a few glazes underneath the forehead, vertical forehead furrows. And that would be these shaded areas right here that you can see in the reference photo, these little patterns that are kind of like rectangles going up and down. Those are going to have to get a little more intense. But I'm going to add a glaze right in underneath his mustache area. Just liven that up a little bit. I'm also going to add a glaze right here on his nasolabial fold to deepen that. And also, I see that right by his nose, there's a really bright color there. It's kind of bright reddish orange, and it's some of that reflected light. Some of that reflected light from his shirt. We want to capture that in there. So we'll just add that glaze, and then we'll also add it here around this shadow that separates the ball of his nose from the wings of the nose. And I'm just exceeding the boundary of my original sketch lines and that first glaze. Just to add a little bit more to it. And I'm going to also add a little bit of this glaze down here on the bottom of his nose. But again, I'm not going all the way into the highlighted area because that's where I need to add that cool glaze. So, just bring that out a little bit. Using this round brush gives me a lot of precision. I'm going past the original glaze. I'm exceeding it by a little bit. I call that a segmented blending technique. I cover that a lot more in my Paint Your First Amazing Acrylic Portrait class. It's a part of Realistic Acrylic Portrait School. And by becoming an all-access member, you'd get access to that class and many others, but more on that later. I just want to point out the segmented glazing technique or blending technique, and that again is where you have a certain spot, certain shadow that you did, a certain little shape, a value within a certain shape, like I was discussing earlier, you know, with continents and nations and states and counties, just a little boundary where that shadow lives. And when you put the glaze on top of that original glaze, you're exceeding that boundary by a little bit. And as you add that glaze on top of the glaze, the original glaze gets a little darker, but then this glaze you just put on, you're going to see that against the lighter area. It's going to shine through. And what it does is it develops gradation. It develops blending and shading. And as you do more and more of these levels, and putting them strategically in the right places, you can really develop a whole series of different shades. I mean, you could have an apple that you're painting, or you could have a ball on a table, and you'd be able to see this smooth gradation from light to dark. It's just amazing. So I just want to show you how that works here, and that's how you do it on this painting. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit of this glaze just to the top of the nasolabial fold on the right side of his face, but only to this top part hitting the nose. I'm not going to go all the way down because I notice on the reference photo that it's just a little darker. It's a little more saturated with color at the top, but down here it's not. So I'm only going to bring it down there. Actually, though, I do see a little bit of a darker value at the bottom, but that's going to be more of a raw sienna. It's going to be a little more yellowish. Again, just studying the reference photo and seeing the differences in the colors. You have to observe it first before you can paint it. So somebody in our Facebook group very kindly mentioned, the idea of studying the reference photo, and I think it's a great tip. Really, it's a good way to go to be able to really know what you're painting. So I would recommend that. But here we have raw sienna that I'm making a glaze out of, and I'm just going to add that to the bottom, maybe with a little bit, a little bit of burnt sienna. A little bit of burnt sienna, okay? And I'm going to add that just at the bottom. I'll mix it a little bit with this reddish color. You can see the mixture that I'm creating right there. And I'm going to add that down here. It's going to take a little bit more to make it happen, but we got to start somewhere. I'm going to add a little bit of this glaze here on the edge of the shadow. And I'm going to bring it right up to the edge of this crow's feet wrinkle like you see in the reference photo. And that's a great way to start converting your sketch lines into paint by just simply painting on top of them and really respecting the boundaries that you created in your sketch and allowing your paint to merge with those boundaries. Okay, that's good. Let's see if I missed any areas here. I could probably add a little bit of a glaze right to the edge of this juxtaposition between the highlighted area and the shadowed area. And then again, pay attention to this lighter value. That again is the reflected light from his shirt reflecting onto the jowls. And you want to leave that vacant. You don't want to paint into that too much, but you can paint down and do that segmented blending technique, exceeding the original boundaries of your sketch shading and your first couple of glazes, and bring that color down a little bit more. I'm going to do the same thing here on this jugal fold, on these jowls here, and bring that down just a bit further as well. Probably should switch into a different brush at this point. Okay. I can't remember if I did the ears or not. I don't think I did. So let me just put a glaze over the ears. The one ear, I should say. So we're going to use this kind of pinkish color from before. Maybe get just a little more organic red orange. Cadmium red would work as well, cadmium red orange. And we're just going to touch a few spots here. I'm going to hit it right there, and then right here. And I tell you what, I could use a different size brush. I'm gonna take this size 8, just a little bit smaller flat. This isn't quite giving me the dexterity that I want. I'm gonna wipe that away. Just use a rag and wipe that off too. But I'm going to use this smaller flat brush right here. That'll give me a little more dexterity. There, that's perfect. Now I can just fill in right in the ear canal, at the top part of the ear, up there. That's good. Yeah, that'll work. Now, if you notice your glazes are getting a little bit chromatically bright, it's better to go too bright than not bright enough with this technique. You can always tone it down later as you start adding some semi-opaque tones on the top. But I think this is it's going to be good to get the skin tones really going in the right direction. So I think I'm going to stop at this step, and we're going to go to step number 2, where we're going to kind of rotate and work on some different parts of the painting, wait for this to dry, and then we'll come back and hit the same area again, doing kind of the same approach, but just a little bit different because it is actually another layer. So I'll see you in step number 2. All right, now on to step number 2. We're going to be adding some glazes to the hat and the background and the shirt, and then after that, we'll go back to some of the shadows in the face and some different things that we missed or just need to do again, because we have to keep adding glazes on top of glazes to really get the richness and depth. So let's do that. Let's take this big dollop of matte medium that I have from before and add some raw umber dark to it. I don't want to waste this matte medium. It's kind of like the lifeblood of my painting here, so I want to save that, use it. Raw umber dark and ultramarine blue, and we'll just do some blending and shading on his hat. But let's really get a nice color here. Let's add just a tiny bit of alizarin crimson, just so the hat doesn't get too green. A little bit of alizarin crimson, and we're going to we're just going to darken, add another layer of shading on the hat here. We'll be going up on the bottom of the hat as well, and just cutting up to the edge, really using these short choppy strokes. And I'm going to exceed the original lines that I established for this divot on the hat and create some blending with this segmented blending technique. Okay, and going to go a little further on the top, using brush strokes in different directions. I'm going to exceed the original line I had here. It went that far. Now I'm going further into it to develop some more blending. And I'm going to go on the top of the bill of the hat. Now, if you're concerned about your painting getting a little bit blotchy, mine is too. I actually think this is a little blotchy, but I'm not worried about it because I know eventually if I put enough layers on, it's going to all smooth out. Plus, I've prayed and I've asked God to help me, and I know He will, so I have that confidence. All right, I'm adding a little bit of shading again to the top of the hat. I'm going to leave this band alone. I actually had to come in later on and I had to add some white paint to that to restore it because I forgot. Yeah, I forgot to leave that area open as I glazed it. So I had to come back later with opaque paint and put it back in, but that's okay. The glazing technique is meant to be your servant, not your master. So use a glazing technique where it helps you out, but if you have to do some detail work, small areas, opaquely, it's okay. And it'll mix in, it'll look great, and you'll still have the benefit of the glazes on the rest of your painting. So Not a big deal. All right, did I hit this area here? Yeah, I better let that dry. Now let's do this area here on the background with another level. And I'm going to add a glaze right here on his neck. That's good. Let's see, and maybe I'm going to switch brushes and use this. Let's use a smaller flat edge brush, this size 8, and let's take a little raw umber dark in this little bit of ultramarine blue, and let's darken this area under his hat a little more. And we just want to overall really begin to get these differences in value. And again, we're going to emphasize these vertical forehead furrows and the fact that his hat is casting a shadow over his entire face. But notice I'm only bringing it down this far. I don't want to bring it down all the way because this color is a little bit cooler in tone, and the colors that are cooler in tone work well for shadows, but not as well for the areas that are lighter in tone. All right, so you wouldn't want to use a bright reddish, orangish color for these shadow areas. No, you want to use that for the areas that are at least mid-tones or lighter in value. It's kind of like this. It's like, you know, when you're sleeping at night and you have your room fairly dark, you've turned off all the lights, maybe you have a little light coming from the street light in the window, but overall your room is quite dark. And you can still make out some objects. You can see, you know, your bed next to you, you can see, well, not your bed next to you, but you can see your dresser drawers, you can see, you know, maybe the closet, you can see your lamp, whatever. But you can't make out the colors. You can't make out the colors very well in very dim lighting. You can see values to some degree, make out shapes, but you can't discern colors because your eyes don't work that way. You've got to have enough light to discern color. And in the same way, in the areas in shadow on the face, on the skin tones, the areas that are very dark in value should not be painted with a chromatically intense color. It should not be painted with a bright reddish or bright orange or bright yellow color. Instead, you want to be using something like raw umber dark and ultramarine blue mixed together. And you can make it a little bit warmer by adding a bit more raw umber, whereas the ultramarine blue, is going to cool it down. And you might, if it looks a little too greenish, you discern in the picture it should have a little more of a pinkish tone. Then you take alizarin crimson, and alizarin crimson is a less chromatically intense version of red. Whereas, you look on your palette, alizarin crimson is less intense than the organic red orange. And of course, you have Indian yellow, and that's a very chromatically intense yellow. The less chromatically intense version of Indian yellow would be raw sienna. Okay, burnt sienna is kind of a bridge between the red and the yellow. It's kind of an orangish color that also works well. But a lot of the stuff he used burnt sienna for, you can actually create this kind of tone by using raw sienna and organic red orange. So I hope that all makes sense, to stick with less chromatically colors for your darker values on the skin tones. On different objects it might change. You know, you have obviously the shirt, it's going to be more to the bluish side. It's not going to be warm, it's going to be cool in tone, but that's because you have a white shirt and it's reflecting blue from the sky above him in the shadowed areas. So there it's going to be different. But here I'm talking more regarding skin tones. Okay, so where are we at? I did the shading on the hat and the background. And let's see. Now I want to add some shadows here. We want to add some shadows here on his shirt. I've kind of neglected the shirt area, but it does definitely need some more shadows. So we're going to want to take our 1/2 inch flat brush, a little bit of phthalo blue, so just dipping into the corner, a little bit of ultramarine blue. I want to get a good amount that I can use, but phthalo blue is very strong, so you do have to be careful not to use too much of it. I'm going to wipe the brush off on a rag a little bit just to get the excess off of my brush, and then dip into the matte medium. And I want to start getting some of the shading for his shirt in here. Just testing this glaze, so making a glaze just by mixing that darker pigment into the medium. Again, very light, I would say 95% medium, 5% paint. And just putting some shading into the highlighted areas. So before I was darkening just the shadows, but now these highlighted areas have their own shadows. These are cast shadows. They have a very harsh edge. Cast shadows from his hat and his face with a very distinct edge. Cast shadows from his collar being cast onto the shirt. But now we have surface shadows, and those are a little different. They're going to have kind of a smoother look, smoother blending. And usually they're a little bit lighter in value, but we do want to get those in there to build up the depth. Just a little bit right here on his shirt by the base of the collar where it hits the neck point. Use my finger just to make that glaze not quite as harsh. Okay, that'll be good for now. That'll be good for now. I want to see if I can use this glaze in the background a little bit, just to promote some color unity, because there is kind of some coolish tones in the background, so we'll add some of this blue to that. It's light enough, and I think that actually, yeah, because I do see a little bit of it right here. And again, that promotes color unity to not have blue all on the bottom of the picture, but to introduce it in a few other spots in the painting. That can be very, very helpful. Just using some very, very fast strokes to smooth that out rapidly. If you're going to do that, I would make sure your blue is very, very light. You don't want to overdo it. And here it actually is maybe a little bit thicker on the bottom. Okay, that's good. That's good. So now at this step, I think we are actually done with step number 2. We'll go on to step number 3. Step number 3, basically what we're going to do is just repeat step number 1. So in this step here, we rotated and we covered a couple areas that we missed, but now we're going to go and kind of redo step number 1, hitting the same areas again with more glazes, building up more depth and more of the skin tone. So I'll see you there for the last step, step number 3. So what I want to do right now, although in the first step I added kind of a warm raw sienna glaze over the whole thing, I'm not going to do that again, but I'm going to do a raw sienna kind of color over some smaller areas, just so I can control the value structure and not close out areas that should be lighter in value. I'm really going to try to pay attention to those smaller shapes, using that metaphor from before. These would be like our states or even counties in a way, but probably more like the states, getting these kind of smaller value shapes within this large area. So I'm going to take raw sienna as the base. Raw sienna, mix it into the matte medium with a little bit of raw umber dark, just so it's not too chromatically intense, so it doesn't get too vibrant, too yellowish. The raw umber dark is more of a cooler pigment than raw sienna, so that will help tone it down a little bit. And with those two mixed together, I'm going to just start adding them up here into this area. I'm looking at this shape on the face. There's kind of a, I don't know what you'd call that, but an inverted triangle, and it occupies a certain shape just like this, just like that. And I'm trying to see that shape and get that rendered in there. Let's see. Maybe I'll bring it down just a little bit more right here. I don't want to overlap that glaze though, or it's going to get too dark on the end. And I'm going to add this glaze just to the jugal fold area, a little bit right here between the chin and the highlight area, so a little bit on that spot. I'm just looking basically for areas that kind of have this more of a yellowish cast to it. I'm going to add it a little bit right here, even though there is some pinkish tones on there too that I'll need to come back and get. Just a little bit right there. I don't want to do too much to it though. Right here, this has kind of that yellowish brownish cast to it. So that particular tint, I want to capture that. I can see it in the reference photo. And let's see. I'm going to also add it right here within the eyes. A little bit on there too. Maybe just a bit over here. So I'm kind of hitting most everything, but not entirely everything. And I'm going to add just a bit on the corner so I can get a gradation. But I'm wiping it off so it doesn't exceed the boundary of the other glaze. Okay. Let's see, under his chin, that can get just a bit darker with this glaze. I'm going to add that. But then the pink is also going to go on top of that too as well. And I'm going to leave that alone on his neck. And now let's do a couple more glazes on the highlight portion of the face. And we're going to have to switch colors here. I'm going to take my smaller flat edge brush, a size 8 or 3/8. And I'm going to work into the other side of the matte medium. I'm going to take organic red orange as the primary color for this, as the main color for this. If you can see that glaze that I'm mixing here. So a little bit of organic red orange. And maybe just a tiny bit of raw sienna. Mix them together. Some more organic red orange, a little bit less of the raw sienna. And I'm going to add that just on the edges of his nose. So I'm going to not, whereas before I shaded all the way across his nose over the whole thing, now I'm just going to hit the edge and develop some gradation that way. And the skin tone at the same time. I'm going to go over this nasolabial fold, but I'm going to bring it out only part of the way. I'm going to go over his cheek a little bit. And I'm going to bring that out only a little bit of a ways into the cheek. I'm not going to cover the whole section, but just I'm going over the shadowed area of his face. And I'm going over the highlight. I'm bridging the gap between the shadow area and the highlight area both. And that's a really good way to build up some shading and depth. Let's see. I'm going to go over his lip just a tiny bit, just using the corner of my brush. And I'm going to also go over this section right here on his chin. A little bit on these highlight areas. I'm still kind of paying attention more to the value more of getting these distinct shapes of the values where they occupy than the actual color. I can dial in the color later with some glazes on top, but I really want to get the values locked in. Again, value is more important than color. As long as the color is close, it's okay, but if you have the values off, it really loses realism quickly. Okay, I'm going to see where else I can employ this, maybe a little bit on his neck. Adding some of these pinkish tones just to the highlights on his neck. And let's see, also, all right, at this stage here, let's continue this. I added some glazes onto the highlight portions. Let's add it onto the shadowed part of the face. That would be the last part of step number 3. I'm going to take the same glaze, but I'm going to add just a little bit more, a little more organic red-orange, bit of raw sienna, and a bit of alizarin crimson, just so it's not too chromatically intense. And I'm going to add that just in these areas that I've already created as pink. There's already a good foundation there, but now I'm going with some smaller glazes on top of the main glaze. And I'm getting more control by using this smaller brush. So we're starting usually generally with larger brushes in the beginning portion of the painting. Towards the end, we tend to shift to smaller brushes. So again, if we're using that metaphor, we're kind of doing the counties right now. All right, we're just doing these small little areas. Let's get this right here by this accessory jugal fold. That has to get darker. And just using the corner of my brush. And I'm not bringing the glaze all the way to the edge. At least over the highlight portion, I'm leaving this area below to shine through a little bit. I'm going to go over my sketch lines just a bit with this glaze, and that'll kind of tie them in together and smooth them out and help them to disappear. Now let's also go over the top part of his face, and we'll add a few glazes. Well, before we do that, let's hit the ear, because the ear is on the left-hand side and I don't want to blur or smear what I'm doing. So I do have to wipe that off with my hand. I'm going to add a glaze right here on his ear, on the inside canal area, and then right here. Not over the whole thing, but just over a few spots. A few key spots. It is starting to get much more intense chromatically, and I will mute it, but I want to get those initial foundations a little brighter. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of alizarin crimson and add that to the mix. I want something that has a slightly cooler pink, and I'm adding that just to the top of this glaze. Just to the top of this glaze, and this would be that shadow that his hat is casting onto his cheek. I'm going to go over the eyes a little bit and kind of get close up and see if there's any nuances I can capture. A little bit up here above his eyebrow, and then also below these vertical forehead furrows. Over here we have a very dark value on his upper nose. I want to get that by adding a little bit of raw sienna. So making this mix a little warmer because that's the color I see in the reference photo. I'm just adding that to the top, just in this specific area. And it looks like it doesn't go all the way down. It goes down about this far. It doesn't go to the bottom of the nose, but there is kind of a little divot there that I want to capture. a little brighter color just at the ball of his nose between the highlight portion and the shadow portion. All right, I'm going to hit just with the corner of the brush, and I'm also going to get this little section right here, right where the shadow, the cast shadow meets the highlight on the right portion of the face. And maybe another glaze on his nasolabial fold, and then also below as well. But here I'm going to grab a little more of this cooler color, this kind of raw sienna, raw umber dark mix where it's more to the yellowish side. And I'm going to use that for this lower part of the nasolabial fold, because that's what I see in the reference photo. Okay. You know, I need to add a glaze into the shadowed area at the bottom. So just really quickly, let's take some burnt sienna. I don't think I've really used that color, but let's take burnt sienna and add that right to the shadowed area. And it's getting a little more opaque. You can see the glaze is getting thicker. Not thickness in terms of texture, but just more opaque. We have more paint, less medium. Now we're looking at maybe 30% paint, 70% medium, or even more. Maybe it's 40% paint and 60% medium. We just want to really darken this area. There we go. Flip the brush over and really smooth that out. Get this shadow nice and rich. We'll be able to come back in later and smooth it out. Let's just add a little bit of a divot to his neck over the sketch line. Begin to establish that a little bit more. Okay, and I think we're kind of at a stopping point here. Yep, I'm gonna close this this masterclass down. I think I've gotten this very far on here, and you'll know what to do to set up your skin tones in the right way. It's going to take some more layers. We don't have it here with this series of layers, but man, we're set up for success. And we're just going to build off of the success of the previous layers, make any corrections we need to as we go along. And I look forward to seeing you finishing up this portrait successfully. You're going to be able to create an amazing work of art. So anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. If you like it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel for more tutorials like this. And of course, don't forget to register for the Portrait Painting Challenge. You can register at realisticacrylic.com/acrylic-portrait-painting-challenge, and I'll send you the welcome kit with everything you need to paint along with us. Look forward to seeing you in the challenge. And then so our next lesson is going to be locking in the facial features, diving in close and paying attention to the nuances of the face and everything that makes the person that you're trying to paint look like them, to capture that accurate likeness. So I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.